Loner rancher won a ghost town in snow country for $70 at auction and found a poor family still living there. Snow had a way of swallowing sound, of laying its cold hand over the mouth of the world until even a man's own breath seemed to belong to another time. Elias Boone rode into the valley under a sky the color of tin, the white hills rising and falling like the backs of sleeping beasts. His gelding's hooves sank to the fetlocks, each step muffled, the air carrying that sharp, clean scent only deep winter knows. Ahead, the ghost town lay still as a photograph, false-fronted buildings leaning under the weight of drifts, signs faded to ghosts of lettering. The deed was folded twice in the inside pocket of his coat. $70 at the county auction, and they'd laughed when he raised his hand. A whole town for the price of a winter's feed, someone had chuckled. Elias had seen no reason to correct them. A man didn't need much, some salvageable lumber, maybe a roof to wait out storms in. It was land, and land had its own kind of truth. He dismounted in the middle of Main Street. The wind prowled between buildings, tossing up skeins of snow. Windows gaped black, doors hung loose on hinges. He could hear the creak of a sign swinging above the old boarding house, the chain straining like tired muscles. That was when he noticed it, too small to be the wind's doing, a thin ribbon of smoke curling up from the chimney, pale against the gray sky. His boot soles squeaked in the snow as he approached. The steps groaned under his weight, boards brittle from years without repair. Before he could knock, a flicker caught his eye, movement at an upstairs window. A boy's face, lean and sharp-boned, vanished back into shadow. Elias rapped once, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the cold. The door opened a hand's width. She stood there, tall enough to meet his gaze, a dark strand of hair curling from beneath a frayed wool scarf. Her coat was patched at the elbows, the cuffs ragged, and the skin of her hands was cracked from a cold. But her eyes, gray as river stone, held steady on his, unflinching. Yes. The word carried no welcome, but no fear either. He touched the brim of his hat. Name's Elias Boone. Just come into town. She glanced past him at the street, as though measuring how alone he truly was. Not much of a town left, she said. He let the silence stand, though the warmth spilling from behind her brushed his face like a memory. Saw your smoke, he said finally. Her fingers tightened on the door's edge. We keep to ourselves. From within came the scrape of a chair, the shuffle of boots on wood. The boy he'd glimpsed before appeared at her shoulder, broad in frame for someone so young, maybe 20, but hollow-eyed, jaw-tight. He looked at Elias, as a man might look at a stranger near his fence line. Elias inclined his head toward the chimney. Winter's heavy this far north. You got enough wood put by. The boy bristled. We'll manage. She cut in, softer but firm. We've been managing a long time. There was nothing in her tone that invited more questions, so he tipped his hat again and stepped back. Well, I'll be staying a bit if the weather lets me. She hesitated as if to speak, then shut the door gently, not a slam, but a drawing closed, as though even the sound might cost something. He crossed the street to the old livery stable, found one stall still half-sheltered under a sagging roof, and led his gelding inside. He laid out his bedroll in a corner, the air smelling faintly of old hay and dust. Through a warped gap in the wall, he could see the boarding house. Light moved inside, shapes crossing before the windows, the glow of a fire casting the faintest amber on the snow outside. The hours fell quiet. Now and then a faint rhythm of voices reached him. Once a ripple of laughter, thin, fleeting, drifted across the street. It startled him, the sound of it. His hands stilled on the buckle he was tightening. For a moment he just sat in the straw, listening, his chest filling with a slow, unfamiliar ache. At dawn, he woke to frost on his blanket and a sky wash pale. He stepped into the brittle air, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. Across the way, the woman was out by the woodpile, splitting kindling with deliberate strokes. Her breath plumed before her. Her scarf had slipped, letting the wind catch in her hair. The boy, son, Shirley, stood watch from a porch, arms folded tight. Two younger shapes moved behind the window glass. A girl on the cusp of womanhood, perhaps 15, arranging something on a table, and a smaller boy, no more than 10, pressing his palms to the cold pane to watch Elias with bright curiosity. When the woman's hatchet stuck fast in a knot, Elias crossed the street without thinking. He took the handle from her, freed the blade with one sharp twist, and split the log clean. She didn't thank him. Instead, she studied his face for a long moment, her breath quickening, before turning back to her work. "You planning to stay?" she asked, her tone neither warm nor cold. "Depends," he said, laying another piece of wood on the block. "Some places are worth the trouble." The boy's voice was tight. "This place isn't yours." Elias's hand stilled on the axe, but he didn't look at him. "Maybe not," he said, "but the snow doesn't seem to care whose name's on what." That earned him a flicker of something from the woman, a tiny lift at the corner of her mouth, gone as quick as the breath that made it. By midday, he'd walked the length of the street, peered into doorways where wind had piled snow knee-high. Most buildings were shells, their insides gutted by time. Still, there was timber worth taking, hinges, and iron that could be sold. He could set up camp, work through winter, and be gone by spring. That was the sensible plan. But each time he passed the boarding house, the scent of wood smoke and boiled beans followed him on the wind, and his gaze went to the curtained window where the younger boy sometimes peered out. Late afternoon brought the first sign of trouble. A pair of sleigh tracks cutting fresh into the snow from the south, stopping in front of the boarding house. Elias stood in the shadow of the livery doors as a man climbed down, tall, thin, his coat too fine for this weather. He knocked, spoke briefly to the woman when she answered. Even from here, Elias caught the way her shoulders stiffened. The man's eyes slid past her toward the darkened interior. When he finally left, glancing once at Elias with a smirk too practiced to be casual, Elias knew word would carry to places where hunger made men bold. A family hidden in a ghost town was no secret worth keeping for long. That night, the temperature dropped until the beams above his head cracked in protest. Elias lay in his bedroll, hat pulled low, listening to the storm work its way through the valley. Somewhere beyond the wind's roar came a faint hum, notes rising and falling like breath. He realized after a moment it was the woman singing. The sound thinned, then ceased, leaving the dark full of questions. He stared at the warped boards above, feeling the cold creep closer, and knew with an odd certainty that whatever had brought him here, it wasn't the bargain of $70. In the morning, the snow would tell him what was coming. Tonight, it only whispered that they were not nearly as alone as they thought. Morning came gray and windless, the kind of cold that seemed to press down from the sky rather than rise from the ground. Elias moved slow through the boarding house's creaking doorway, his knock answered not by words, but by the smell of heat and steeping tea. Eliza May sat near the stove, bent over a shirt in her lap. Her needle moved with a steady patience, though the thread between her fingers was frayed to almost nothing. A chipped mug steamed beside her, the scent faintly floral in the room's stale air. Maybeth, the middle one, stood at the table shaping biscuits from dough that looked as thin as her wrists. She glanced at him through lashes lowered like shutters, offering a small, awkward smile that seemed more apology than welcome. "You're early," Eliza said without looking up. "Light's short this time of year." He stepped in, shaking the cold from his coat. His eyes took in the walls, each papered over in faded flowers worn pale by decades. Corners sagged, seams curling away as if the room itself had been trying to remember another life. Silas entered from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. His gaze went straight to Elias, steady as a rifle barrel. "We've work enough without minding strangers." Maybeth's smile vanished. Eliza's jaw tightened, though her needle didn't pause. Elias looked to the nearest window, its latch dangling useless. The gap let in a faint whistle of cold. Without asking, he crossed the room, lifted the sash, and wedged the latch back into place with the tip of his knife. The wood gave under his pressure, soft with age, but the hook seated firm. "You'll lose less heat now," he said. Silas's voice came sharp. "We didn't ask you to fix anything." Eliza's eyes lifted to Elias for the first time, the faintest crease between her brows. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of someone unused to giving them. He nodded once, then set his hat on the chair nearest the stove. Wind's bringing more snow from the west. You'll want the woodpile close. Her fingers stilled on the needle. We keep it stacked near the shed. It's enough. He didn't argue. He'd seen the lean pile out back, logs scattered more than stacked, and the dull hatchet hanging by its loop. A family that had lived this far into the cold on their own had earned their pride, but pride didn't split wood or close up a draft. Mid-morning, hoofbeats crunched in the street outside, a lone horse, steam rising from its flanks. The door swung open without a knock, and a man in a fur-trimmed coat stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. His gaze flicked over Eliza, lingering in a way Elias didn't like. "Well, I'll be," the man drawled. "Didn't think anyone was fool enough to hole up here all winter." His eyes cut to Elias, surprise creasing his brow. "And you are?" "Just passing through," Elias said. The man's smirk deepened. "Funny. Folks say this town was sold. Must have been a real bargain." Elias said nothing, but he saw Eliza's knuckles whiten around her sewing. The man shrugged, sniffed the air. "Beans and bread. Better than what most got." His gaze shifted to the younger boy peeking from a stairwell. "Cute kid. Bet he'd like some candy next time I ride through." Elias's jaw worked once before he spoke. "Best keep your candy. Roads get slippery this time of the year." The man's smirk twitched, a challenge unspoken. But after a long moment, he tipped his hat to Eliza and stepped back into the cold, leaving the door ajar until Elias shut it. When he turned, Silas was watching him, still guarded, but with something less certain in his eyes. Later, Elias spent the afternoon hauling wood from the grove beyond the edge of town. The snow under the pines was lighter, their green arms catching the weight before it fell to the earth. Jonah trailed him for half the walk, his breath puffing small clouds, his questions spilling out shyly, about horses, about rifles, about how far a man could ride in a day if the trail was clear. Elias answered each one in the slow, measured way he spoke to colts, careful not to startle, not to spook the fragile trust being offered. Jonah's boots left smaller prints alongside his in the snow, and Elias found himself lengthening his stride just enough that the boy could match him without running. By the time the last load was stacked, dusk had pulled long shadows through the street. Lamps flickered to life inside the boarding house. Elias caught sight of Maybeth leaning on the sill, chin in hand, watching the snow sift down in the orange light. Inside, the air was warm, the stove ticking softly. Eliza ladled beans into bowls, one more than usual. She set it on the table without looking at him. "Eat before it gets cold," she said. He took the seat nearest the wall, the warmth seeping into his fingers as he wrapped them around the tin bowl. The beans were plain, but they filled the hollow space in his gut better than he'd expected. Jonah slipped into the chair beside him, chewing loud enough to earn a nudge from Maybeth. Silas sat across, his eyes flicking between Elias and his mother. "You planning to stay long?" Silas asked finally. Elias met his gaze, long enough to see what needs doing. Eliza's spoon stilled midair, but she said nothing. After the meal, Elias returned to the livery. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something faintly sweet from the boarding house. Maybe those biscuits Maybeth had shaped that morning. He lay on his bedroll, staring at the rafters, the image of Eliza's hands mending cloth fixed in his mind. Hands that had done more than their share of work, that had kept walls standing when the world outside would have let them fall. In the middle of the night, a sound woke him. Not wind, not snow. Hoofbeats again, slow, deliberate. He rose, pulling on his coat, and eased to the door. A lone rider passed down the street, the same man from that morning. His head turned toward the boarding house as he went by, the look lingering too long before he vanished into the dark. Elias stood in the cold until the sound of hooves faded. The snow fell in fine, silent sheets, blurring the street, softening the lines of every building until they seemed half forgotten. Behind him, the livery smelled of old hay and leather, a shelter but not a home. Across the way, the boarding house window glowed faintly. A shadow moved inside, tall, straight-backed, pausing as though aware of eyes on her. Then Eliza drew the curtain, and the light became only a suggestion in the snow's heavy dark. Tomorrow, Elias knew there would be more wood to cut, more small repairs to make without asking. And maybe, if he was right, more eyes in the dark that didn't belong to the wind. The storm began with a slow whisper against the windows, a restless brushing that built hour by hour until the wind's voice was a howl threading through every seam of the old buildings. Snow fell so thick it erased the street between the boarding house and the livery, and by the second day, the world beyond the walls had ceased to exist. Elias had moved inside, not from invitation, but from necessity. The livery roof had begun to sag under the weight of the drifts, and Eliza had stepped into the storm herself to tell him he was coming in before the cold claimed him. Her words had been brisk, but her eyes had lingered a moment longer than they needed to. Now he sat near the door, bedroll against the wall, the smell of wood smoke wrapping close around him. Eliza worked at the table, sleeves rolled to the elbows, mending a quilt, so worn the batting showed in pale bursts. The air was warm, but her fingers still bore the red map of winter's touch. Maybeth hummed in the corner, her voice low and shy, a hymn almost lost in the crackle of the stove. Jonah lay on the rug with a battered deck of cards, shuffling them in clumsy handfuls. Silas stood at the window, staring into the white void beyond, as though he could will the snow to part. Elias watched the room the way a man watches a fire, quietly, knowing the light can't last forever without tending. His gaze kept finding Eliza's hands, the measured precision of her stitching. When the hymn faltered, Eliza glanced at Maybeth. "Go on," she murmured. Maybeth's cheeks flushed, but her voice rose again, thin at first, then fuller, filling the room with a tune that seemed older than the boards beneath their feet. Eliza joined in on the second verse, her tone warmer, sure. Elias felt something in him ease, a knot loosening, though he didn't let it show. At supper, the pot of stew was thinner than the night before. Eliza ladled carefully, making sure each bowl was even. She passed one to Elias without looking directly at him, and he accepted it with the same unspoken understanding that had begun to grow between them. Halfway through the meal, Silas set down his spoon with a clatter. What happens when the snow stops? No one spoke at first. Jonah looked from his brother to his mother, sensing the edge in the question. Eliza's eyes stayed on her bowl. "We keep on. Men like that traitor aren't going to stop coming," Silas said. "They know we're here now. We can't keep living like shadows." Elias met his gaze. "You planning to fight them all yourself?" "I'll do what I have to." The boy's jaw was set, stubborn and frightened all at once. "There's more than one way to win a standoff," Elias said, his tone even. Silas's eyes narrowed. "And what would you know about it?" "Enough to still be breathing," Elias replied. The air in the room shifted, still warm, but charged. Eliza's hand touched Silas's arm, a silent call to stand down. He did, though not without a glare toward Elias. That night, the wind rose so high it rattled the stovepipe. Snow hissed against the glass like sand. Elias lay in the narrow space between his bedroll and the wall, listening to the boards creak as the building settled under the storm's weight. Somewhere in the dark, Eliza's voice came soft, speaking to Maybeth. Nothing more than a murmur, but it carried the steadiness of someone holding the center when the walls pressed in. By morning, the storm had pressed the world closer still. The windows were half blocked by drifts, and the door stuck when Elias tried to open it. They were snowbound. He set to work clearing the threshold while Silas brought in more wood. Jonah handed kindling to Maybeth, who laid it carefully by the stove. Eliza swept up the damp from the melting snow with brisk efficiency. The hem of her skirt darkened where it brushed the wet boards. Later, when the light dimmed to that peculiar blue of storm-thick winter afternoons, hoofbeats sounded, muffled but close. Elias straightened from the hearth. The knock on the door was hard, the kind that presumed it would be answered. Eliza opened it a crack, snow blowing in around the edges. The traitor from before stood there, 2 other men behind him, their coats crusted white. His smile was thin. "You've got more company than I expected," he said, glancing past her to where Elias stood. 3-day storm and you still manage a fire. Must mean you've got stores worth sharing." "No trade today," Eliza said, her voice flat. The man's gaze slid back to Elias. "And you figured you for the type to take what's yours. Unless you found something better to keep you warm." Elias didn't move from the doorway. "Road's bad. You'd best ride before dark." One of the others shifted, his hand resting near his belt. The trader's smirk twitched, but he stepped back. "We'll be back when the snow lifts," he said, his tone a promise rather than a warning. Then they turned, their shapes vanishing into the white as though the storm had swallowed them whole. When the door shut, the silence was heavier than before. Eliza's hands were still on the latch, her knuckles pale. Elias met her eyes and said quietly, "They won't stop coming." Her lips pressed in. "I know." The rest of the day passed with an unspoken tension running beneath every task. Elias mended a loose board in the back wall. Silas fetched water from the well, his shoulders rigid. Jonah stayed close to Maybeth, following her like a shadow. That night, as the wind eased to a low moan, Elias sharpened his axe by the fire. Each slow scrape of the whetstone was a thought he didn't put to words. Eliza sat across from him, mending again, her head bent over her work. In the lamplight, her hair caught a glint of silver where the fire's glow touched it. At one point, her gaze lifted to his. For a heartbeat, neither looked away. Then she returned to her stitching, but the line between her brows had eased. Jonah's voice came small from where he lay under the quilt. "Will the snow stop tomorrow?" Eliza smoothed his hair back. "It always stops sooner or later." Elias watched her hand rest on the boy's head, gentle and sure, and thought, not for the first time, that storms outside were easier than the storms a person carried inside. When he lay down that night, the snow was still falling, but softer, like ash from a fire burning low. He closed his eyes, the image of Eliza's gaze meeting his lingering in the dark. He didn't yet know what he would do when the snow ended, but he knew he couldn't walk away when it did. By the time the storm broke, the world was not the same shape it had been. Snow lay in soft, heavy mounds against the buildings, erasing steps and fences, smoothing out the rough edges of the town. The sky was a pale, washed blue, the kind that promised cold but not more snow. Elias saddled the gelding at first light, the leather stiff from frost. "I'll be back in 2 days," he told Eliza, standing in the doorway as the others lingered behind her. Flour, sugar, candles. Her hands were tucked into her apron pockets. "It's a long ride for one man." "I've done longer," he said. Her eyes searched his face, but she only nodded. The trail to town was hard and glittering, the snow crusted from the night's freeze. The cold cut into his lungs, but he rode with the steady pace of someone who knew the price of rushing in winter. At the trading post, the warmth of the stove hit him like a shove, carrying the smell of tobacco and wool. He bartered pelts and a spare rifle for what they needed, wrapping each item in burlap. But as he waited for the last of his purchases, he caught the drift of conversation from 2 men at the counter. "They say Boone bought that ghost town," one said, voice low. "Word is, a family's been squat in there. Woman, 3 kids. Pretty one, too." "Won't be long before someone decides to collect on that," the other replied. "A place like that's worth more than a handful of pelts." Elias tied the burlap bundles tighter than necessary before heading out. The sky was already deepening toward afternoon, and his jaw worked against a muscle that had gone tight. He reached the ghost town by lantern light, the windows of the boarding house glowing faintly in the dark. Eliza was outside, bent over the chopping block, her scarf loose, hair dusted white with frost. The hatchet in her hands was dull, biting shallow into the log. Her breath came in quick, visible bursts. Without a word, Elias took the handle from her. The hatchet was near useless. He dropped it, pulled his own axe free, and split the log in 2 clean strikes. She stepped back, rubbing her hands together, her eyes on the steam rising from the fresh cut. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "I did," he said. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, something unspoken in it, before she turned toward the door. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the scent of beans and bread thick in the air. Maybeth and Jonah unpacked the bundles with the excitement of a holiday, stacking flour and sugar on the shelf, the candles in neat rows. Silas watched from the corner, his arms folded. But his eyes softened when Jonah laughed over the sight of rock candy tucked at the bottom of one sack. They ate with the kind of quiet that came from both gratitude and the awareness that it would not last forever. Eliza sat at the head of the table, her hair loose now, a strand catching in the lamplight. Elias found his gaze drawn there more than once. Later, while the children settled into their corners, Silas stepped out back. Elias followed, the night air brittle between them. "You can't keep doing this," Silas said without turning. "Bringing us things. Fixing things. You'd rather I let the roof fall in?" Silas's breath clouded white. "I'd rather we didn't owe anyone." Elias took that in, the boy's pride like something he recognized from years back in his own reflection. Not everything comes with a price you can measure. Silas didn't answer, but his shoulders eased just slightly before he went back inside. In the days that followed, the cold deepened. The trader didn't return, but the absence felt more like a held breath than a reprieve. Elias kept the work, mending the back wall, hauling more wood, checking the stable roof. Sometimes Eliza would appear beside him without a word, handing him a tool, her hands brushing his in the exchange. Those small touches stayed with him longer than they should have. On the fifth evening, snow began again, soft at first, then heavier, until the world beyond the lamplight blurred. Elias had just finished securing the shutters when hoofbeats came, muffled but close. He stepped into the street as three riders emerged from the swirling white. The trader was in front, his smile sharper than the wind. "Heard you've been making yourself useful here, Boone. Funny thing, most men wouldn't work so hard for what ain't theirs." Elias stood in the snow, the lantern light catching in his eyes. "This land's mine by deed. What happens on it is my say." The man's smile didn't falter. "And them?" He tilted his head toward the boarding house. "They belong to you too?" Elias didn't answer, but his stillness spoke enough. The trader's gaze flicked past him toward the windows, where a shadow moved, Eliza watching. "Won't be long before someone less friendly than me decides to claim them," the man said, pulling his reins. "Think about that." They turned and vanished into the storm, leaving the air colder than before. Inside, Eliza was standing just beyond the door. "What did he want?" she asked, though her eyes already held the answer. "Nothing worth giving," Elias said. She studied him for a moment, as if weighing something she'd been holding back. "They'll keep coming." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "I know." The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the back, Jonah laughed at something Maybeth said, the sound warm against the night's chill. But in Elias's chest, there was only the sharp awareness that the storm ahead wasn't made of snow. And when it broke, he knew there would be a price to pay for every night he'd kept the fire burning here. The morning the snow spoke, the air carried a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the world had paused to listen. It was a kind of cold that crystallized breath before it left the mouth, the sky low and white, the wind absent, an uneasy calm that Elias recognized from years of reading land and weather. He had been splitting wood behind the boarding house when the sound came. Hoofbeats, slow and measured, crunching through the crust of snow on Main Street. He set the axe down, his breath thick in the air, and stepped out to see them. Three riders, the trader among them, their shapes materializing from the pale distance, like memories you wish you could forget. Their horses' flanks were crusted with ice, steam curling up from their nostrils. Eliza appeared in the doorway, the hem of her skirt brushing the snow. She had her hands in her apron pockets, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Silas moved to stand beside her, the boy's jaw tight, his frame grown hard in these long weeks. Behind them, Maybeth's face hovered at the edge of the curtain, Jonah clinging to her side. The trader reined in a few yards from Elias, his smile stretched thin against the cold. "Morning, Boone. Thought I'd see if you'd come to your senses." Elias didn't move. "My senses are fine." The man chuckled without humor. "You've got something here worth taking, and I'm not talking about the lumber." His eyes slid to the doorway where Eliza stood. "Folk like her don't get to hide out in the edges of the world forever. Someone's going to take her and the rest under their hand. Might as well be me." The snow seemed to take offense at his words, a light wind stirring loose flakes from the rooftops, sending them skittering through the space between them. Elias stepped forward, boots sinking deep. "This land is mine by deed," he said, his voice low but steady. "And the people here are under my protection. You ride away now, and maybe the snow forgets you were ever here." One of the trader's men shifted in the saddle, his hand ghosting near the butt of his pistol. Silas took a step out onto the porch, the boards groaning under his weight. He didn't have a weapon, but his stance carried the sharp edge of someone ready to take a hit if it meant buying a moment for the rest. The trader's smile thinned to a straight line. "You think standing in the middle of the street with your big talk's gonna scare us off?" Elias's gaze didn't waver. "No, but maybe the thought of dying in a place the snow will swallow before spring will." The wind rose then, as if answering him, rushing down the street, rattling signs, lifting powder from the drifts in sudden, swirling gusts. The world blurred in white. In that shifting curtain, Elias's figure stayed rooted, his coat snapping in the gust, the dark of his frame a fixed point against the storm's rising voice. Eliza stepped out onto the porch beside Silas. Her hand rested lightly on the boy's arm, but her eyes were on Elias, unblinking. The sight of her there, shoulders squared, chin lifted, shifted something in the air. It was no longer a lone man against three riders, but a line unbroken, that included her. Jonah slipped out too, clinging to his sister's skirt. Maybeth put a hand on his head, her small figure a quiet but unyielding presence. The trader's horse shied against the wind, stamping at the snow. He glanced at his men, then back at the figures on the porch. There was something in their stillness, Elias in the street, the family at his back, that didn't bend to the cold or the threat. Finally, the trader spat into the snow. "You'll regret this." He jerked his reins, turning his horse. The others followed, their shapes swallowed again by the white. When they were gone, the street held the hush that follows a bell's last toll. Elias stood a moment longer, watching the snow close over the hoofprints. Then he turned toward the porch. Eliza met him halfway, her boots leaving neat impressions in the drift. They stopped close enough for him to see the quick rise and fall of her breath. "You didn't have to put yourself between them and us," she said, though her tone carried no rebuke. "Wasn't between," he replied. "Was with." Her eyes searched his, and for a heartbeat the cold seemed to fall away. She looked as if she might speak, but instead she reached into her pocket and pulled out one of the small candles he'd brought from town. She pressed it into his hand. "For your room, in case the dark comes early." That night the wind quieted, but the cold deepened. Inside, the fire burned low, the scent of wood smoke thick in the air. Elias sat near the stove, the candle she'd given him flickering in the center of the table. Across the room, Eliza mended a sleeve, her head bent, hair falling forward to catch the light. Silas sat by the window, whittling something small and precise, while Maybeth read aloud from a weathered book, her voice soft but sure. Jonah dozed against her side, his breathing even. It struck Elias then, how the boarding house, once just walls and a roof, had become a place that remembered the shape of voices, the warmth of shared meals, the rhythm of life that didn't flinch from a storm. When Eliza glanced up, their eyes met across the lamplight. This time, neither looked away. The snow outside pressed against the glass, but in that moment, he felt the rare weight of knowing where he belonged. Later, as the children slept and the fire settled into embers, he stepped outside. The street was a white ribbon under the moon, every building softened, the sharp edges hidden. The snow whispered under his boots, a sound more felt than heard. He thought of the trader's promise to return, the way men like that tested every claim until they found the one thing worth taking. He knew the storm had bought them time, but not safety. Still, as he looked back at the boarding house, warm light spilling from its windows, he also knew the line he'd stand on if it came to it. And in that stillness, the snow seemed to speak, not in words, but in the way it settled on his shoulders, cool and certain, as if marking him. It carried the quiet truth that some winters a man doesn't just endure, he chooses who he endures them with. Inside, Eliza moved past the curtain, pausing as though she'd sensed him there. Her face was lit from within, her expression unreadable yet steady. She lifted her hand in a small, almost tentative gesture, and in it was the whole of the promise neither of them had yet spoken aloud. He raised his in answer. The cold pressed in close, but he didn't feel it. The snow was still falling, erasing the trader's tracks, covering the street in a white so deep it might hold until spring. And Elias Boone, who had bought a ghost town for $70, understood at last that he'd been given something no deed could ever name.